With mold, the thing is, it's often something that a person gets exposed to and really has no idea that they have. I mean, certainly there are homes and workplaces, and we've all been there, I'm sure, at a friend's house or maybe even in our own home, and we've seen it on the wall growing, and that's an obvious case. But the majority of what I typically am dealing with most clients is invisible mold, whether that's growing in a place that isn't out in the open. Sometimes it's actually on drywall behind a wall. It could be in a crawl space in a basement. It could be a number of different locations that aren't necessarily areas that you're seeing on a day-to-day basis.
And welcome to Resolve IBS and IBD Naturally. I'm Courtney Cowie, a nutrition therapy and functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner. If you are struggling with the symptoms of IBS or IBD and want to get to the root cause of your symptoms so you can take back your health through a whole person approach, this podcast is for you. Just a disclaimer that the information I'm presenting in this podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be taken as medical advice. You should always consult a qualified practitioner before making any changes to your health or medical regimen. That being said, let's get on with the show.
So, today's topic is on the topic of mold toxicity, and specifically, is mold toxicity part of your IBS, IBD, or autoimmune struggle? So, healthy assumption that the majority of you are here because you're struggling with some kind of ongoing gut issue, whether you've got an IBS diagnosis, perhaps it's more serious, it's in the IBD category, or secondarily, you've been diagnosed with autoimmune disease, or you perhaps suspect that you are somewhere on that autoimmune spectrum. And we could even say, for the sake of argument, that IBS is also on the autoimmune spectrum. So, really, that means that this particular topic, in my mind, could pertain to quite a number of you, especially if this is something that you've never encountered before, never considered. It's a topic that's very near and dear to my heart because it is currently the health journey I am still on. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it took me a long time to really realize, understand, and identify that toxic mold exposure was a big driving factor for initially what I was diagnosed with as IBS and then later as microscopic colitis. So I will talk a bit about why it's so common with these types of disorders. But let's start a bit by just talking about mold, period, because I think on some level we all understand mold is bad. Nobody wants to eat a moldy piece of fruit. Certainly we all have a working assumption that if we see it in a house, like black mold on the wall, that's a really bad thing, and we don't want to, we want to deal with that. And I even remember years and years ago when I was younger and obviously more naive than I am now, back in my, mid 20s, looking for potentially my first home to buy. And this would have been right around the time we had that market crash and the housing bubble. There were a lot of homes on foreclosure going for cheap. And I can't tell you how many I walked into that had very obvious signs of mold. And as a very free-spirited 20-something-year-old, I didn't really understand the implications of just how dangerous that was. But I do remember the realtor saying how difficult it would be to get a conventional loan or a loan through certain lenders like HUD if there was certain non-starters like mold found in a house. And now, obviously, fast forward many, many years, being a practitioner with the expertise and knowledge I have, I completely understand why. Mold is basically a ticking time bomb, especially for landlords, especially for homeowners, especially for anyone dealing with properties of any sort. And I won't go too far down this rabbit hole, but let's just say it's very much, when it comes to buildings, one of those areas that there isn't a lot of strong legal protection around for a homeowner or a renter, especially if you find it in your home. But just understand that it's a big deal, and anyone who owns properties gets a sniff of potential mold, that's enough to really make them scared, because it's a very, very dangerous toxic substance indeed. How toxic is it? Well, the US military actually uses it as one of the primary sources for bioweapon development, believe it or not. So quite toxic, probably one of the most toxic living organisms on the face of the earth. It's considered a biotoxin. It's in the same family of living toxins as actually all of the ticks that are associated with the Lyme disease camp and those co-infections. infections. So it is in that same category, although very different than obviously a tick-borne illness. We'll be talking actually more on that next week. So I definitely invite you back if you find this topic interesting. And if especially you feel you have Lyme disease or suspect you might have Lyme disease as part of the health picture you're struggling with. But suffice it to say, it's very toxic. The other thing that a lot of people might not realize is that most antibiotics are also derived from mold, because mold is very good at producing toxins that will kill off bacteria. And that's essentially the mechanism that antibiotics are working by. It's to kill off bad bacteria in the body, but doing it through a mold origin. So just kind of a clinical pearl I'll share with you is, if you happen to be a person who tends to react very poorly across the board to different types of antibiotics, this would be a yellow flag for me that there might be some degree of mold toxicity going on. It could also be a mold allergy as well, which is different, and we might touch on that a bit. But something I definitely would think of if this is part of a case history I'm talking through with a client. So it's very toxic, and that's kind of the bottom line. And because of that, we need to take it very seriously, especially if, as a clinician, I suspect one of my clients is coming to me and is full or colonized with toxic mold. And we'll talk about how that happens in just a moment. But essentially, I want to just say that of all of the different issues I deal with, whether it's IBS, autoimmune disease, what have you, anything on that spectrum and outside of that spectrum, I personally feel mold toxicity is one of the most challenging issues and challenging cases to work with, because it's so emotionally devastating, in that it will always imply doing an assessment of and often making major decisions around a person's home and work environment, which, as you can imagine, impacts major areas of their life. For sure, their financial stability, their emotional health, right? Like it's very difficult to, it's one thing to treat the body because the body is ill, but to do that and also at the same time have to make major decisions and potentially invest a lot of financial resources into renovating a home, remediating a home, or changing a home, or even making a job change, that often augments the stress and overwhelm to a point where it can get very emotionally devastating and very, very challenging. And, having personally lived this, I totally understand that. And sometimes as a practitioner, it can be difficult to stand in that spot and sort of walk a person through that decisional process. And not that I make the decision, but literally lay out the facts of, this is essentially what's needed for you to fully recover your health, and ultimately what you decide to do is your decision. And obviously each person has different resources available and different constraints around what is and isn't possible in making some of these decisions, but having to be that emotional stalwart for them to walk that path, it is a privilege, but it's very challenging at the same time. And I consider myself very fortunate that I've had a good number of people struggling with this who have entrusted their health to me and have entrusted me to be a guide on that journey for them back to health. And saying that, we definitely don't do this for, fortune, so to speak. This can be a very emotionally challenging journey for the practitioner as well, because you really do feel for what that person on the other end is going through, all the more so when you've been through it yourself and completely understand it. So with mold, the thing is, it's often something that a person gets exposed to and really has no idea that they have. I mean, certainly there are homes and workplaces, and we've all been there, I'm sure, at a friend's house or maybe even in our own home, and we've seen it on the wall growing, and that's an obvious case. But the majority of what I typically am dealing with most clients is invisible mold, whether that's growing in a place that isn't out in the open. Sometimes it's actually on drywall behind a wall. It could be in a crawl space in a basement. It could be a number of different locations that aren't necessarily areas that you're seeing on a day-to-day basis. And the other thing is, it can also be odorless. Of course, if it's prolific enough, you will smell it, right? But let's just say it's not necessarily necessary for it to be visible or potentially smelled in order for that environment to be toxic for the right person. And so this gets into another component to this illness. And before I do that, let me just say too that it's thought that 50% or more of all buildings have actually had some degree of water damage. It can be as benign as a small leak that wasn't caught within a day or two, that wasn't remediated properly, that led to some water damage where now mold grows, and this can actually, grow to a point where it is causing some mycotoxin release into the environment that again could make the right person sick. So the older the building, obviously, the more likely it is to have a history of water damage. But let me also say that brand new buildings are definitely not a guarantee to be mold free either. And a lot of that comes back to how well it was constructed and how essentially the soundness of the practices, whether things were drying out properly, were things left out to get wet, were there heavy rains, where there were leaks coming in during the build, right? Like there's a lot of factors that can impact new builds. So that's not necessarily a guarantee either. So really, no matter which way you look at a building, you have to be very diligent and do your research to know the history if this becomes part of your own health picture, right? But back to, how does it affect a person? This is really the big question. And the interesting thing about mold toxicity is that there is thought to be a genetic component to this particular illness. And Dr. Richie Shoemaker was one of the pioneering physicians in the mold toxicity spectrum, decades ago, actually starting this research and seeing a number of mold sick people. And he was one of the first to suspect that there were certain genotypes, certain components to genes that help to regulate the immune system specifically, that were showing up again and again and again in mold sick people. And he actually, if you go to his website, which I believe is survivingmold.com, you click around in there, there's actually a grid in there showing different genotypes that are mold susceptible. He's actually mapped them out as far as Lyme susceptibility too. But point being, not everyone in the functional medicine space necessarily agrees that genetics play a super key role with this, but enough people do that it's very compelling. And the idea is that the genes in and of themselves don't dictate the sickness. And that's always true because of the reality of epigenetics, and genes have to get signaled by the right triggers. But let's just say that it's thought that up to a quarter or a little bit more of the population carries what are called these haplotypes that are susceptible, if signaled properly under the right conditions, to turn on this reality of mold toxicity in a person, meaning that once the genes are signaled, if this individual happens to then move or live or work in a moldy building, the likelihood that they're going to become mold sick is very high. And so why does this happen? So it's thought that genetically speaking, in certain individuals, obviously, let me just say, if it's a high degree of mold toxicity in any building, anyone can get sick because mold is that toxic, right? But a lot of times, really what we're talking about is multiple small to moderate exposures for the unfortunate right susceptible person over the course of time that leads to this accumulation of mold in their system. And so how does this happen? The idea is that with these specific haplotypes expressing, the way the immune system is functioning in these specific susceptible individuals is there's a disconnect between the two arms of the immune system that deal with invaders that come in right at the front, as well as like the specific destroyer part of the immune system. And so you might have heard of what's called the innate arm of the immune system, and then there's the adaptive arm of the immune system. And so very, very generally and simply put, the innate arm of the immune system is non-specific. It's sort of your general surveillance patrol, moving around in the body, checking everything and looking for something that looks suspicious. Once it captures that particular suspicious person or critter, right, pathogen, so to speak, it'll actually signal to the adaptive side, which is the more specialized forces, or you could say intelligent side of the immune system. And it'll say, oh, we found this guy right here. Let's create a specific immune cell to go after and destroy this thing and eliminate it. And this is essentially what happens anytime we get sick. We're having these two arms essentially work together, where the innate is sort of capturing, identifying, and signaling, and then the adaptive sort of creates this inherent perfect cell to take out the bad guy, right? And what's thought to happen in mold sick people is that there's a disconnect between the innate being able to actually accurately and effectively signal the adaptive. And so what'll happen is that mold toxins come into the system. Often and it's thought just widely through functional medicine community, they're coming in majority wise through inhaled means, meaning that they're coming in because a person is living in a mold contaminated environment. And so when it gets into our body respiratorily, it can obviously circulate into the blood and circulate anywhere and everywhere. Mold toxins do love nervous system tissue as well as fat deposits. So and just an FYI, that's where the body tends to put toxins in adipose or fat tissue to sequester them away from the vital organs. But in general, biotoxins do have an affinity for the brain and the nervous system as well, which is also part of the symptom cluster that shows up with these toxins as well. But once it's in the system and circulating, the innate immune system gets signaled and activated. And you can think of it as it's trying to sort of communicate and get the adaptive system online to come after these mycotoxins, but there's a disconnect. And in the end, the body doesn't have the ability to effectively target, tag, and eliminate the mold toxins from the body. And so you've got this innate system that's now hypervigilant and overactivated because it's aware there's all of these toxins circulating around, but without the help of the adaptive to do the actual essentially like track down, kill, and eliminate piece of this. And so part of what happens, and this can happen sometimes, it's seemingly slowly over time, is that the mold load will start to accumulate, because in a person who's susceptible to this, often they're getting it in through inhaling, but as the body struggles to actually eliminate the toxins, they just become more and more accumulated. And then this will obviously drive more symptoms, more immune activation, to a point where usually there's this threshold where now a person's really feeling unwell. And if that cycle continues, depending on what genes are getting signaled and what's getting activated in the body, that could obviously lead to any number of diagnoses, whether that's IBS, IBD, or other autoimmune diseases. And pretty much the entire autoimmune spectrum is game with mold. And this is partly why mold exposure is linked with autoimmunity. It's because of the way it activates the immune system, and because mold sick individuals struggle on the one end from the immune system standpoint to actually accurately tag and eliminate these toxins. I do want to mention that another way mold enters the body, and this is thought to be less important, is through moldy contaminated food. However, it does become relevant, especially as a practitioner when I'm working with a mold sick individual. I do give people typically a very specific list of foods to avoid that tend to be the more commonly moldy foods, because we really do want to limit any and every entry into the body possible. Is there enough mold on food to make a person sick? What's really thought is that yes, people are consuming moldy food, but the amount they're getting in comparatively to the amount we breathe every day and the amount that can circulate in a moldy environment, hands down, it's really sort of thought that airway and respiratory inhalation is the majority of how people are getting sick with mold toxicity.
Thank you so much for listening to this podcast episode. Can I ask you a favor? Would you be willing to hit pause, give this podcast a quick rating, hopefully it's a 5-star, and even leave a comment or question that I'd be happy to respond to? This really helps to beat the podcast algorithm so that this free content can reach more people struggling with gut health issues like you. I appreciate your feedback and willingness to support this podcast. Now back to the show.
So let's talk about some of the symptoms that do go hand in hand with mold toxicity, because I kind of touched on the fact that it has an affinity for the nervous system, for fat tissue, right? And again, it kind of depends on the person and what genes are getting signaled and where they're going on that symptom spectrum, but it's a broad range of things. I mean, anything from any kind of motor coordination issues, obviously severe brain fog or any kind of brain functioning issues, including obviously autoimmunity of the nervous system, whether that's MS, any kind of neurodegenerative disease. It could even be seizures for some people. There's obviously a significant mental health impact that happens when a person is mold sick. So extreme cases could be something like bipolar or schizophrenia, all the way down to depression and anxiety. A lot of times there's a connection between weight gain and mold exposure. Again, for similar reasons that I mentioned, it's first and foremost a safe place to store these toxins, but there's metabolic dysregulation that happens when mold starts to accumulate in the body with leptin signaling that makes it difficult for a person to start to regulate or keep their metabolism functioning in a healthy way. And often with mold sick people, they're not eating excessively, but they'll start to actually gain weight. Now, there is a small percentage of people that will go the opposite and actually lose weight. So it's not necessarily a given. Thyroid dysfunction and dysregulation, and often that's showing up as hypothyroidism, sluggish thyroid, or even Hashimoto's. So lots of that. And then, of course, the gut symptomology and fatigue is another one I should mention too. Severe fatigue is very, very common with mold because, again, there's so much immune activation happening in the system. But moving on to the gut, a gut dysfunction of any sort is almost always part of this picture. And it could be seen as mild, depending on how a person's presenting, to super severe. In that, I mean all the way to like inflammatory bowel disease level dysfunction. And depending on too, whether a person, once they're exposed to toxic mold, gets what's called colonized, meaning the mold is actually able to like take up residence and thrive and live inside the body. Typically where the mold will end up colonizing is up in the sinuses or in the GI tract somewhere. And because of that, you see a lot of symptomology at the level of the sinuses and the GI, because that's predominantly where the mold is living, as well as obviously nervous system tissue, the brain, and fat deposits. So, just gut disruption of any sort, bloating, weak digestion, diarrhea, constipation, stomach cramping, you name it, the whole gamut, GERD, it can all be associated with toxic mold exposure. The other thing is mold produces a substance called mycophenolic acid, which degrades the lining of the small intestine and sets the stage for a leaky gut, which often is already present before a person becomes mold exposed and mold toxic. So it'll actually just accelerate and worsen that, which is why as a practitioner, it's not uncommon for me to see more and more and more food sensitivities that happen sometimes quickly, but definitely over time in a mold sick individual. It's like they're going the wrong direction, and foods they used to tolerate, they're just losing tolerance with time. And it's partly because the gut lining gets so degraded and there's so much inflammation. Mold will actually cause reactivity to gluten in a person who isn't gluten sensitive to start with. So even if you are gluten sensitive, it's going to heighten that, but it's very, very common that people that don't have gluten sensitivity actually develop it through mold exposure. And that's something that if you're fortunate and you're not at a point where you're gluten sensitive to start, once you get well from mold, it's possible potentially to be able to tolerate gluten again. Of course, I never recommend that anybody eats gluten as a mainstay of their diet, but just to say that there's a high degree of correlation and just furthering of that issue. If a person's consuming gluten, it absolutely is magnified with toxic mold exposure. And it also depletes the microbiome because it's a toxin, and it's going to crowd out beneficial bacteria, and it's going to, attract all of the other bad guys, be it parasites, yeast, you name it, right? Like it's kind of like the bad guys like to hang out, the good guys like to hang out together. So once you get a pretty noxious toxin like mold set up residence in the gut, you're looking at a recipe for trouble in the microbiome. It's going to deplete that. But I did want to say just very quickly that there are certain signs that make me think of mold toxicity in a client. This isn't something I necessarily test for out of the gate because I've worked with it enough that I feel I can start to get a hunch and identify it if I feel someone might be in this camp. But typically, if a person's got multiple systems of the body affected, they're overly sensitive to the supplements I might be using to clear infections, or they have lots of food sensitivities, And then just generally very, very debilitated in a number of different ways, whether it's headaches plus diarrhea plus fatigue plus joint pain, right? Like that type of picture would make me think, this person might have some mold exposure. And if it's an ongoing kind of cycle of these symptoms and they're not really having a lot of days where they feel well, that's another kind of yellow flag for me.
Did you find this episode informative and helpful? I'd love to have you leave me a 5-star rating. Do you have questions about holistic approaches to optimizing gut health that you'd like to ask? Please leave your question or comment below, and I will be sure to address it personally or cover it in a future episode. Be sure to check the show notes for any resources mentioned in today's episode. See you next time.